The Ignatian lecture was established by the Society of Jesus, which is commonly known as the Jesuit order, and is named to honor the Society's founder, Ignatius of Loyola, Saint Ignatius of Loyola. The lecture was conceived as part of the Society's social outreach and its commitment to the principles of social faith and justice as they were articulated in its 32nd General Congregation, at which, as its educational apostolate, the Society agreed that it would dedicate itself, A, to throw light on the main problems which the Church and humanity ought to be coming to grips with today, B, to place an emphasis on the conscientization, according to the gospel, of those who have power to bring about social change, and to give a special place to service of the poor and oppressed, and C, to help prepare both young people and adults to live and labor for others and with others to build a more just world. Tonight's speaker, John Dalla Costa, seems to us to be ideally situated to speak in the spirit of the Jesuit commitment. And John's topic, the Ten Commandments, a theology for business leaders, certainly provides a context for a discussion about social change, about living and laboring for others, about conscientization according to the gospel. Indeed, John is well aware of the ideals of social faith and justice, as those ideals are espoused by the Jesuit order. His thesis supervisor, as John was working towards his Master of Divinity degree at Toronto's Regis College, was Jesuit ethicist and current Dean of Regis College, Father Ron Mercier. That thesis was an analysis of the Jubilee debt as a model for engagement and cooperation between faith groups and the institutions which form the global economy. Not surprisingly, therefore, John has published 4 books dealing with issues relating to business ethics. For those of you who may wish to purchase one of John's books, Chuck Arian from Wordsworth has got a copy of Working Wisdom, The Ultimate Value of the New Economy, for sale at the back. Unfortunately, his most recent book, John's most recent book, is out of print, but you can get a really good deal on this one at the back. And, of course, John will be glad to sign it for you. John is the founder of the Center for Ethical Orientation, which is a Toronto-based consultancy working with business and non-government groups to foster a global ethic for the global economy. John is very well known internationally as a stimulating and challenging speaker, and we are honored to have him with us tonight to present this year's Ignatian lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, John Dalla Costa.
Good evening. This is my return visit to the St. Jerome's lecture series, last year having accompanied my wife, Lucinda Vardy, who spoke about feminine spirituality here. Once again, the hospitality has just been superb, and I would like to express my respect and gratitude to Michael Higgins for setting the standard, to Doug Lutzen for the introduction, and for really caring for me through this whole process of managing my arrival and my participation, and to David Seljic for the invitation to present the 2003 Ignatian lecture. When David called me in June, I was just beginning 2 projects that were pointing me towards the topic we finally settled on. We knew a lot about Enron, but obviously not that a litany of scandal would be composed during what turned out to be a summer of shame. From my consulting, I knew that most companies had business ethics programs. In fact, Enron was one of the most aggressive in publicizing its ethics and social responsibility. Analysts, including many experts in business ethics, were bemoaning the excess and imbalances that had replaced checks and balances. My take was a little different in that I regarded this scale of corporate impropriety as the ethical failure of our whole system of business ethics. I was just starting to write a new book, exploring the terms for a new business balance sheet premised on Simone Weil's needs of the soul. The question, compelling and confusing me, concerned the foundation for such a business model. In our global economy and in our multicultural society, what provides the bedrock for managerial morality? The second project involved society at large. This staggering breakdown in business credibility occurred in continuity with some even more shocking transgressions in other sectors. The torture and murder by peacekeepers in Somalia, the criminal negligence of public workers in Walkerton, the billions misplaced by the federal government at HRDC, and billions more misdirected away from health care by the provinces, partake in many ways of the same moral irresponsibility that seemed to have infected the banks and the companies and markets of the global economy. And not only our institutions, but also our leaders abused the public trust. Ken Lay, the CEO of Enron, and Cardinal Law, the CEO of the Archdiocese of Boston, seemed like twins, both in the casual way they responded to ethical catastrophe and by their refusal to take moral responsibility until public pressure forced their ouster. Business obviously has a fever, but it is the whole society, including its religious heart, which has come down with the moral flu. Analysts, again, had been tracking these shocks to gauge what's called consumer confidence, especially in relation to what it does to markets. Again, my take was a little different in that I wanted to understand confidence from a more holistic and holy perspective. Confidence has become a synonym for self-esteem, but it literally means to live with faith. Well, do we still trust each other? Do we still trust our future? What are the personal and societal costs of living with ever greater suspicion? How do we make meaningful and robust the idea of living faithfully? I discussed some of these questions with John Hunkin, the CEO of CIBC, and he agreed that the economy and society coexist on an infrastructure of trust, what Francis Fukuyama, Robert Putnam, and others have called social capital. We decided at that meeting, again, this is early June, to co-sponsor a national study on the state of trust in Canadian society. And I was just framing the questions, working my way through the methodology, when the call came from St. Jerome's. The heart of both of these projects concerned, as I said, the foundations of our moral decision-making. As a businessman who believes in God, as a theologian seeking terms for Christian discipleship in our essential but messy global economy, I wanted to know what has become of our memory of the Ten Commandments, and what is the role of these commandments, or what academics, scholars call the Decalogue, in shaping our relationships, accountabilities, and common cause. What you will hear tonight draws key themes from this new book that I've been working on, which is about 2/3 of the way complete, as well as insights from the recently completed Trust Project. When I said that CIBC had co-sponsored with my Ethics Center this study, I should have explained that they funded and supported, while my colleagues, Carol Fall and Jim Allen, and I, did the asking and the reporting. Completed only last month, this project was made up of an anthropological study, what our researchers called a dig, 13 focus groups across the country, a national quantitative survey with over 2,000 Canadians, and 24 one-on-one interviews with CEOs, heads of non-government organizations, research mavens and academics, deans of business schools and of schools of theology, as well as community services advocates, including leaders in the poverty movement and in the refugee servicing movement, refugee care movement. Before serving up the outline of what I want to cover tonight, let me just give you the greatest hits, the top line of what we learned going through this exercise of investigating trust. Just to give some context for what will come next. First, equity markets lost over $7 trillion since 2000, wiping away value equivalent to $700,000 per American household. Much of this staggering loss relates to speculation, which we could call a transgression against the 10th commandment prohibiting coveting. Some of this was the result of outright fraud, a violation of the 8th commandment prohibiting stealing, and some of it was just due to false accounting, which we could say breaks the 9th commandment prohibiting false testimony. Second, what analysts called a few bad apples turned out to be bushels. Entire industries have been implicated. Pharmaceutical companies, all the blue chip pharmaceutical companies, virtually all of them, paid $750 million to settle price fixing charges. Banks and brokerage companies in the U.S. have so far paid more than $1 billion for their blatant violations of conflict of interest during many of these issues that we're still unraveling. And the electricity companies have paid hundreds of millions of dollars to California as restitution for supply manipulations that embezzled about $30 billion from taxpayers. Entire industries are at play, and often Canadian companies involved in global markets, involved in a North American market, are also implicated in a lot of the impropriety. However, point number 3, lest this seem to be only a corporate problem, a recent survey by Ernst & Young reported that 25% of Canadian workers admitted to committing some fraud against their employer. 1 in 4. Much of this is small-scale stuff, charging personal long-distance calls to the company. But increasingly, this internal theft, because that's what it is, involves information and intellectual property that by some estimates is worth up to $175,000 per violation. Number 4, not surprisingly, this ethos damages credibility and confidence. In our national study, 8 out of 10 Canadians believe strongly that trust in our society has suffered a steep decline in the last few years. And all of this was structured by the researchers so that we really only took the measures of the people who felt it strongly. 8 out of 10 felt strongly that we were in some type of suspicion freefall. 6 out of 10 admit in the last few years to having changed their behavior so that they now primarily engage institutions or corporations, and to a degree each other, with the expectation that their interests will be compromised or transgressed and that they therefore need to protect themselves. It basically was that before you would go into an organization or into a public service with the expectation that you could trust them until they let you down. Today, the opposite is happening. People are going in expecting to be let down, wanting the trust to be earned through performance, and generally not finding that it lives up to their expectation. Number 5, while the scandals that I listed, and I only listed a few of them, have inflamed suspicion, the actual loss of trust in society has been by 1,000 cuts. More precisely, by the 1,000 daily indignities that have accompanied the lean and mean restructuring, first by companies and then more recently by governments. In general, people, us, feel a gnawing impotence, a despair, a sense of lost voice no one is listening. No one is hearing what we're saying. And as a result, anger about ever more frequent discourtesies, like auto attendants that don't really attend anyone. Number 6, a dispiriting perception in the research, in the data, is that leaders in all spheres, not just business, but in all spheres, generally evade accountability for their decisions and actions. No one seems to be in charge, and no one seems to step forward when mistakes happen. The people at the top, whether in governments, companies, school boards, or churches, seem more and more removed from the human consequences of their decisions. For markets as well as society, point number 7. For markets as well as society, the fraying of trust represents a huge cost, and we're only beginning to tabulate it. Suspicion adds material cost to transactions as we impose new regulations, demand proofs for investors or consumers, and face hard security costs such as those at airport check-ins. Suspicion also adds friction cost to decisions as we argue from ever more rigid ideologies and come to compromise only through deflating confrontation, as happened with Kyoto. And suspicion also creates a hope cost as we diminish our expectations for the future, assuming, as happened with human genome mapping, that every advance will lead to some type of exclusion or constraint by copyright. Number 8, the cumulative impact of these experiences of suspicion is a worsening of common purpose within Canada that we've described in our summary as 3 degrees of separation. Feeling burned, we resort to disconnection. Feeling mistrustful, we practice disengagement. Feeling isolated, angry, we experience social, communal, and interior, what we call disintegration. In many ways, the progression implicit in these 3 degrees is fueled by a chronic carelessness. We care less and feel less cared for, and as a result, we become more careless about the environment, careless towards the homeless, careless towards our highways, allowing, rusty guardrails and weeds to grow up. Just a general sense of not caring. Mary Jo Letty, who many of you will have read or may know or have heard here, alerted us from her work with refugees to a very important but often forgotten dynamic. As well as being relational, trust within a community is also an aesthetic, in that the creation of beauty in public spaces creates environments for engagement, while dilapidation reinforces instincts of withdrawal, suspicion, exclusion. Number 9, suspicion is indeed a drag, but to a degree mistrust and the cynicism it spawns are really only a smart defense mechanism. Everything is becoming a branding exercise, which means that every experience is becoming loaded with persuasion or spin. Our public space has become selling space. Maple Leaf Gardens was a hockey shrine, while the Air Canada Centre is a marketing mosque that includes hockey as part of a larger entertainment and advertising experience. The point is not that marketing is bad, but that there are fewer neutral public spaces to be together without being pulled to consume. Everyone, number 10, agrees that our institutions are in some moral crisis. Lou Gerstner, the recently retired CEO of IBM, who basically went through his entire 10 years of running the corporation with a stellar reputation for strategy and unimpeachable integrity. He's one of the really important success stories of the last decade. Argues that we do not need more regulations, which add more of those costs I was talking about earlier. He says what we need are more moral business people. Now, this is a hopeful language, and it's language a lot of people can nod and say, yeah, we agree with, but it's also very vague language. And in our research, we asked business people, community leaders, and others to define the terms of integrity in situations of leadership. And you find very, very generic kinds of answers coming back. If we look at what we measure, which is always an indication of what we really value, we've been measuring society's ethical failures by adding up the squandered dollars and lost jobs, by keeping count of arrested executives. Lou Dobbs on CNN, I think, is saying that it's now 27 people have actually been arrested since Enron first broke. We've been tallying reforms and regulations and new proposals, but no one, either in business or in politics, has dared to invoke the Ten Commandments during this time of chronic ethical distortion in both our public and private sectors. The implication at the root of this talk is that we are struggling with the consequences of ethical erosion without valuing the animating source of our basic moral principles. Part of this is due to our secular reverence for the divide between personal belief and public policy. But part of this silence is also theological, I discovered. While a consideration in dialogue, especially in work, for example, that Hans Kung has done on a global ethic, my research this summer shows that most other moral, ethical theologians are presenting Christian ethics ideas with only indirect or no reference to the Ten Commandments. In the recent book, Church on Sunday, Work on Monday, an excellent book, Laura Nash from the Harvard Divinity School and Scott McLennan from Stanford write, quote, "We were also struck by how the business and religious professionals mirrored each other's strategies despite their differing economic ideologies." Again, despite a superb analysis, Nash and McLennan, like so many other moral theologians, omit any grounding in the Ten Commandments through their whole work. This missing consciousness affects not only theory but also practice. In an August 2002 interview in Time magazine, consumer advocate and part-time presidential candidate Ralph Nader asked the most piercing question of all. Angered by the scale of corporate scandal, he wondered, where were all the whistleblowers? Since these complex frauds involve the expertise and systems involving thousands of people in hundreds of companies, why had so few, only a handful of women, exposed the malfeasance? We must ask this question slightly differently. Where were all the believers as these crimes were being committed? What were all we who believe in God doing while God's law was being trampled in our companies and public sector? In their recent book, Managing as if Faith Mattered, Helen J. Alford of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas and Michael J. Naughton of St. Thomas University in Minnesota write, "Unfortunately, the current spiritual awakening in the West does not always lead to a full engagement of faith and work. People can exclude God from the workplace by over-personalizing faith at the expense of examining the organization's policies and systems in the light of justice." Again, an important contribution. But even in this work, the Decalogue is largely absent, hovering as an implicit resource, a shadow rather than a pillar. My project tonight is to revisit this neglected foundation, to undertake what theologians call retrieval, but with a twist that managers call a relaunch. I will go back to the biblical story for context to experience the radical meaning of Mosaic law for the people only a few months into their wilderness trek, and to discern the implications that have shaped our history, religions, and culture. You will hear language that is not scholarly, in part because the relaunch demands that we do a commandments check for business. the intent is not finger-pointing, but critique towards revealing the basic operating assumptions that are so befuddling to managerial morality. I will then do more retrieval, this time to reflect on the reframing we inherit from Jesus Christ, and I will close with another relaunch, suggesting operational or strategic questions for renewing business ethics practice through the covenantal promise of the Ten Commandments. It's a lot to cover. As a Catholic, the Ten Commandments came to life for me as 2 parts catechism and 8 parts Charlton Heston. In the real story of God's chosen people, the commandments are like the center pole holding up a tent, the key support element that gives shape and stability to the whole narrative structure. The encounter with God at Mount Sinai is the climax of the Exodus. And while the Israelites had more wandering to do before coming to the Promised Land, they, in a sense, were already at home as soon as they accepted the law from Moses. This moment of covenant was neither easy nor linear, but it was revolutionary, ending forever any estrangement with the divine. Jewish theologian Arthur Green explains that in accepting the Torah, in accepting the law, quote, we accept in human reality that divinity is present to humans in human language and human institutions, and we accept the challenge to create a society that embodies this presence. Moses' descent from Mount Sinai did not end the theophany, but instead initiated God's living presence among God's people. The heart of the law is a paradox involving obedience and freedom. The Israelites had been enslaved by a political and economic system that regarded their humanity as a commodity to be exploited for production and construction. Tellingly, the covenant was not bestowed at the moment of release from bondage in Egypt. Instead, Moses was given the tablets only after wandering in the wilderness, an experience of spiritual surrender during which the people could begin to reframe their identity apart from their economic masters and reclaim the dignity inherited from being in the image of God. The Israelites ceased being slaves when they crossed the Red Sea, but they only became truly free, truly God's people, when they accepted the covenant involving the Ten Commandments. The story of the law at Sinai in Scripture is in a sequence of blessed interventions, with God providing manna from heaven to satisfy people's hungers, pouring water from a rock to sate thirst, and exercising power through Moses' extended arm to defeat the marauding Amalek. The law was the pinnacle gift, but still the people of God only accepted it reluctantly, kicking and screaming, just like the rest of us would, every step of the way into liberation and transcendence. The great German novelist Thomas Mann calls the Ten Commandments the basic instruction and rock of respectable humanity that serve as what he calls the ABC of human behavior. This notion of the Decalogue as an ABC is profound because it serves exactly as a basic grammar for realizing our full humanity. Grammar has rules, not for the sake of imposing limitation, but to enable communication, to free expression, to ease reception, so as to deepen relationship. We obey rules of grammar to relate. We obey to communicate. We obey, ultimately, to be free. The Ten Commandments, as you know, governs 2 sets of relationships, those with the divine source and those between people. Similar treaties between rulers and subjects existed prior to Moses. Biblical archaeologists generally agree that the structure of the Mosaic covenant included elements from the more ancient Babylonian legal code of Hammurabi. What is revolutionary in the Jewish laws is that the ethics of social harmony are sanctified so that they are a means of living out the full reality of an individual's soul while in the full experience of community. The commandments allow us to live spiritually in history, making what we do in the concrete reality of everyday life of transcendent significance. Although we've added layers of reason and law to our understanding of human rights, the basic intuition for this inalienable dignity is rooted in the consecration from the Ten Commandments. There are two other contextual points to remember. First, the Ten Commandments were given through Moses to a people, to a community, a nation. This is significant because morality is at once a personal and a wholly shared responsibility. Breaking a commandment certainly injures individuals involved and triggers personal accountability, but such failures inevitably also fracture and sully the whole society, stunting and fracturing the whole of creation. Again, think about some of the corporate scandals. There were individual investors that were burned, individual employees that lost their pensions, but the tear was to confidence throughout society, to credibility throughout society, and the repercussions worked themselves out even in the developing world, which was being forced to adopt certain models and a whole bunch of other things that started to fall apart because those scandals tore the fabric. So it just ricocheted and rippled out. The second point is that the Ten Commandments had to be given twice. As you know, when Moses emerged from the clouds on Sinai to present the new covenant, he found that the people had reverted to idolatry. In a rage, must have been Italian, Moses smashed the tablets. And then, only after pleas from his repentant people, did he go back up the mountain for a theophonic replay. On one level, this is another example of humans preferring even the certainties of tyranny to the obligations of freedom. But on another level, this is actually a story of partnership. The rabbinic speculation is that the first iteration of the law was too onerous. In quotes, calling upon us to be godlike to a degree we could not stand. The second encounter over the commandments turned out to be collaborative, with God asking Moses to carve the tablets upon which the law would be written anew. As Rabbi Green explains, quotes, this new marriage is to be a partnership, fashioned together of human and divine effort. The law, in this second iteration, was finally received not as a burden downloaded by a higher authority onto some subservient subject. Instead, it became a co-responsibility by which God and human beings live together and co-continue the project of creation. So with this context, I will now do a 1-minute relaunch of the Ten Commandments, the 10 big ones, I call them. First, God comes first. Second, there is no second. Third, holy, holy, holy is God's name. Fourth, life is hard and the commandments are tough, so take at least 1 day off per week. Fifth, this is not theory, so practice the law first with your own family. 6, since you do not create, do not destroy, and never, ever presume to destroy another human life. 7, be faithful in your intimate relations to live in the everyday faithfulness to God. 8, since you did not create, do not take what does not belong to you. 9, the truth will set you free, so never, ever bear false witness. And 10, since greed is the opposite of creation, dividing, despoiling, and degenerating, do not be greedy. Now this relaunch compresses a lot, but it also suggests an inherent unity. In the case of the Ten Commandments, the whole is a perfect sum of the parts. The commandments are discrete, yet fully interrelated. To steal, for example, is also to practice deception, a form of idolatry, and to practice greed. This means that adherence is not simply cannot be an exercise in cherry picking. 8 or even 9 out of 10 is not good enough. Breaking any one commandment, in effect, breaks them all. And living with integrity, any one of the commandments, links us to the totality of obligations and graces from the whole covenantal relationship. In organic unity, the Ten Commandments are both a protection against enslavement and the most essential enabler of the soul's human freedom. While bequeathed to the Israelites on Mount Sinai, it is clear from history, from our own history, that every generation faces pressures of enslavement from human systems that institutionalize imbalance, or from human beings that seek either destructive advantage or just make mistakes. Every generation confronts its own exodus, its own wandering in the wilderness. For the most part, we presume that slavery, like polio, is an infirmity defeated by modern progress. This presumption is wrong. Indeed, the conflict between enslavement and freedom is at the core of every soul's journey, defining, testing every society in every time. Most of us have awakened to the dark secret of literal slavery in our global economy, mostly involving the trafficking of women, illegal immigrants, and children for sweat labor or the sex trade. According to the current issue of Foreign Policy magazine, the smuggling of human beings is the fastest growing form of organized crime, a $7 billion industry involving many of the 500,000 illegal immigrants that enter the U.S. every year. UNICEF estimates that 200,000 children are enslaved every year in West Africa alone. And in India, hazy statistics, but at least 2,000 people every year sell their organs into the illegal international transplant market. Though on a different scale, there are, of course, other forms of slavery, including addictions, fears, and psychic imprisonment to success or fashion. We have all experienced people in restaurants or even on a beach that jump to answer their cell phone or BlackBerry, not recognizing that they have just been tugged out of the present by a wireless shackle. Sometimes the slavery is to despair, to a resignation that accepts the status quo as the best option available. Wealthy societies have in some cases become enslaved to practicality, determining that they cannot afford to do anything about issues like global warming or homelessness. Even CEOs, and I've worked with many of them, and I talked to many of them in this project, even CEOs often feel their own hands tied, having to make decisions that knowingly compromise the long term to meet the imperatives of the short term. This sense of inevitability or inescapability is a warning that we are not really free, that we are living instead within the embrace of camouflaged enslavement. Holding this defining dichotomy between freedom and enslavement, I will now do another quick retrieval. The first commandment gives priority to God so that we place our dependence for freedom only in the hands of the infinite and not in those flawed ones of human invention. This is exactly why the first principle in AA's 12-step program asserts belief in a higher power to invoke grace and become free of addiction by surrendering our needs and hopes totally to God. As moderns, we presume that freedoms are a function of the legal system, of rights or charter or precedent. But as Margaret Visser explored in a recent Massey lecture, laws are negative rather than positive. They can prevent or punish abuses, but they cannot cause desires. Laws legislate, but they cannot create. The second commandment demands exclusivity, because our default position as human beings is to make things or achievements, status, wealth, power, position, the substitutes for relationship. These are the golden calves of desire. In his Massey lecture in the early 90s on the modern malaise, Charles Taylor observes that by investing so much meaning in our things and experiences, we have made survival a substitute for the heroic. More and more, this pushes us to extremes in sports or in sports utility vehicles, seeking heightened meaning only from being outside the ordinary. I have friends who work in the banking industry, and I've also had the opportunity to work with a lot of banks. And it was very interesting watching, especially some of the really high-profile, highly paid talent that was involved in international derivatives tradings and stuff, go through the boom of the late 80s and early 90s, of the late 90s and then early into the new millennium. The kind of energy, the kind of adrenaline rush that these people moving around hundreds of millions of dollars, blowing, $15 million to the bottom line in one telephone call, was really a form of economic bungee jumping. I mean, they had to make the next deal just to get that same thrill. And sometimes, the further you have to fall, the closer you are to just losing control, the higher the adrenaline rush. It's like our whole financial system got into this extreme energy of finding meaning by just cut another deal, survived, another day done. And when we look at our financial institutions and recognize what's happened in the global economy, they are like the nervous system of the global economy. Just a very few banks have a huge impact on hundreds of corporations, on thousands and thousands of employees and communities. So when competitive pressures go to an extreme in an industry that is at the heart of the nervous system for everything else, it just raises the adrenaline pressure everywhere. The third commandment gifts familiarity, knowing God by name and having access to God. Since we inevitably sin as well as strive, this familiarity is a lifeline to justice and mercy. But beyond incredible accessibility, the key lesson is that we can actually take God's name in vain two ways. By speaking it in cursing or in violence, or by not speaking it at all. How free are we in a secular society that does not allow us to name God in discourse about economic policy or corporate strategy, or that sees a holiday tree as more appropriate than a Christmas tree, which we just went through in Toronto? The fourth commandment sets rest as a condition of faithfulness. Religious educator Marian Harris calls the Sabbath recreation for recreation, the period for prayer and play, reflection and renewal, so that we can partner with God to do the tough work of creation. Production and productivity, like creation itself, is exhausting. The holiness of the Sabbath recognizes that humans are so biased towards the achievements of work that we are forever at risk of exhausting ourselves, as well as of exhausting the earth. Even now, we confuse enabling as automatically freeing, accepting, for example, a capacity for 24/7 work and production as progress, which to a degree it is, but without questioning what is becoming a digital reversal of the Exodus. The fifth commandment consecrates relationality, making family the fulcrum for practicing covenant, for also prayer and worship. The point here is that we are never free without others, that liberty is always a realization within belonging and relationship. To live apart, especially apart from community that bestows identity, is not so much autonomy as imprisonment from isolation. The sixth commandment links all life in a web of integrity and integration. We are free as long as others value and respect our claim to life, and we grant freedom through reciprocal reverence. Terrorism defeats freedom by inspiring random fear. Murder, as explained in the rabbinic literature, not only ends a life, but also terminates the community's possibility for perfecting creation in freely exercised partnership with God. The Talmud says that every human being carries creation. So to kill an individual human being is to kill creation. The seventh commandment sacramentalizes human intimacy and sexuality. When love becomes just another satisfaction, when it is experienced merely as an exercise in choice, we risk the dehumanizing instrumentality that sustains the demand to which slavery is the supply. The eighth commandment calls for generosity. Generosity of heart to accept the inviolability of what belongs to others. The ninth demands that we respect truth through honesty. And the 10th suggests that serenity cannot be acquired, that we are most enriched by our need for living in relation and not by our wants. Stealing, lying, and coveting all knot us in a tangle of guilt and deception, all stunt our relationships, giving objects or giving experiences precedence that insult God and injure others. And all three represent a distortion of truth. So let me now do another relaunch. This time, 10 commandments in 10 words. Priority, exclusivity, familiarity, creativity, relationality, integrity, fidelity, generosity, honesty, and serenity. Now let's go through these again as a balance sheet, juxtaposing the theology with the corporate reality. Commandment 1, priority. Business 1, profit. I do not mean this as an automatic negative. Profit is necessary and profit is important. But when profit becomes the only or dominant priority, then all other human and social factors become literally subservient. In our trust study, we found that people felt that the primacy of economic considerations was behind persistent problems like homelessness. I've called this the despair from pragmatism, whereby we now only dream within the curtailed horizon of what we can afford. Commandment 2, exclusivity. Corporate 2, competitiveness. Now again, not bad, but everything in business is about choice. Competition does two things. It makes all choices valuable, if only for being an alternative, and at the same time it makes the alternative in which we have a personal stake become all important. A recent article about Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, spoke of a company so zealous that its sales force operated almost like a religion, complete with scriptures, ritual, and what the writer called revival meetings. And of course, Microsoft's not alone. The language of religion is now rife in the language of corporate culture. But it becomes the priority and the exclusive priority that, of course, creates the damage. Commandment 3 is familiarity. Corporate reality is neglect. In his wonderful book on the landscapes of the soul, Sociologist Douglas Porpora reflects on some jarring statistics from a recent Gallup survey in the U.S. While over 90% claimed belief in God, more than half of these believers also claimed that their belief in God had no bearing on their day-to-day decisions. Half said, "I believe, but it doesn't change a thing I do." Even if we carry God's name in our hearts, we profane that name by leaving it unspoken in the hallways and boardrooms where Sabbath has been sacrificed on the altar of productivity. Again, based on U.S. data, economist David Korten has shown that the average work week increased by 15% in the 1990s. 15% is 1 day. Average now is a 6-day work week. And that doesn't count all the time that our cell phones and fax machines and emails and everything else keep us going. We're too busy to pray, too busy to rest, too busy to reflect on the spin, waste, and existential emptiness of all this busyness. Fifth commandment, relationality. Corporate efficiency. A few companies have taken on the challenge involved in balancing work and family life, and as a matter of fact, at dinner tonight we were sharing some examples of some really enlightened companies that had educational facilities built into their operations. But by and large, companies are actually going in the other direction, demanding more and more work and longer hours. Walmart is a particular case in point. If Microsoft has created a religion for its employees, Walmart has tried to create family. In fact, many of its workers have accepted less pay and have put off unionization for the fact that the work environment is more comfortable and respectful. Now, more and more Walmart stores are going 24/7. And as reported this summer in Fortune magazine, more and more employees are confronting the dislocation of shift work. The company that grew by becoming a surrogate for family is now disrupting the real life of families. Sixth commandment, integrity. Corporate utility. There are legal products that often kill literally, like guns, cigarettes, and alcohol. And there are many more legal products that kill indirectly, like pollution, or even McDonald's French fries. You know, I mean, we can argue about ninja brands, but the point is that utility is too low on the value spectrum to be an absolute. Nobel economist Amartya Sen argues that, in quotes, a utilitarian conception provides a defective and systematically biased view of well-being. The aim of economics for Sen is not development, but rather the human freedom that development enables. Economics as the means, not the end. Seventh commandment, fidelity, corporate, sex sells. Most of you, like me, are probably big fans of American football. That also means that most of you, like me, have seen lots and lots of Budweiser commercials featuring boobs and babes. That's probably the first time that word's been spoken at an Ignatian lecture series here at St. Jerome's. But for a while in the 1990s, it seemed that the feminist sensibility had affected a sea change in marketing and in business. But the renewed unapologetic sexism suggests that any restraint had really only been political correctness. This seems more annoying than significant, But with young teen girls now opting for breast implants, it is clear that personal integrity is increasingly jeopardized by our high-profile flaunting of sexuality and fidelity. Eighth commandment, generosity, corporate reality, greed. The business press has joined the chorus condemning the egregious excess of some CEOs, but for the most part, analysts have not questioned the underlying excessiveness that has become the competitive norm. Our study revealed that our hearts know the truth about greed, that it's become familiar and even acceptable, and that it's disguised under many names. Sometimes it's called tax cuts. Other times it's called shareholder value or stock options or return on capital. And again, it's not that any of these things are wrong. It's that when they are taken as the only priority, they distort and disrupt all the other priorities and voices within society. This issue of the systemic nature of greed was pointed out in some of the articles this summer that were exploring what had happened when WorldCom went through its collapse. And I guess $9 billion is the level of fraud that finally forced the company into bankruptcy. And everyone focused on what that meant to the shareholders and, of course, what that meant to employees who lost pensions and thousands, of course, lost jobs. But again, the interrelationship that the commandment recalls occurred in that example as well. It turned out that Sprint, trying to compete with WorldCom, was forced to cut its employees thousands and thousands of jobs to try to reach the productivity levels that WorldCom was using to retain a high share price, a high valuation by investors. Now, it turns out that that was a false standard, but that meant that Sprint and all the other telecommunications companies in the chain had already had to make the adjustments against that false standard. So there were hundreds and thousands more people who were affected by that moment of real greed. Ninth commandment, honesty. Business, it's accounting. Once a tool for managerial accountability, results have increasingly become a tool for marketing, polishing the numbers so that the numbers polish the share price and reward executives. Last week, the New York Times reported that 330 of the largest companies in the U.S. have restated or will have to restate earnings for the 2002 fiscal year. A third of our large companies may not have set out to lie, but a third of our companies are now admitting that they did not tell the truth. 10, serenity, commandment, corporate marketing. On the average day, we now face over 6,000 selling messages, each aimed with strategic precision to engage and activate some type of coveting. Politicians and celebrities are now positioned as brands, as are countries, remember Cool Britannia, and even charities. By definition, if everything is a brand, then every interaction is strategic, and every horizon of meaning defined by some goal for advantage. Again, let me stress my premise. My premise is not that all business is bad and the market inherently evil. What I'm saying is that business is too important to be left untethered to some grounding morality. Jonathan Sachs, the chief rabbi of the UK, writes, "Markets are the best way we know of for structuring exchanges, goods to be bought and sold. They are far from the best way of ordering relationships or preserving goods whose value is not identical with their price." The point is, business is essential and effective, but it is also wholly incapable of managing in and by itself the responsibility, in quotes from Rabbi Sachs, that we have for the world we hand on to our children. Obviously, the challenge of integrating business success with moral purpose is very difficult, but hard is not impossible. Our current managerial frame and competitive practices have changed. We need to remember there's been a lot of dynamic movement in the way markets behave. In the last decade with NAFTA and globalization, in the last generation in response to environmental regulation, in the last half century as value has been created from knowledge and information, and in the last century as labor movements corrected the excesses of the robber barons. Our way of doing business is one way, but not the only way. The imperative to break rigidities is formational to a holy life, and hard though it is, our task as business people of belief is to break the managerial assumptions and conventions that violate God's law. According to the Talmud, whoever conducts himself with integrity in his economic affairs is as if he fulfilled the whole of religious life. From this perspective, the commandments are a catalyst instead of a constraint, a resource for innovation and freedom rather than rules for limitation. Uniquely to our moment, we are caught in a vacuum between two privatizations. The social and corporate one, pushing public assets and accountabilities out of the control of regulators and into markets, and a personal one, a personal privatization, by which faith and spirituality are validated as long as they remain personal. At the same time that failed privatization has created the need for moral imagination in the corporate realm, privatized spirituality has worked to mostly absent principles of faith from discussions about corporate governance, social responsibility, and executive compensation. How then do we close this gap between faith and practice? How do we reassert the meaning and promise of the covenantal law without violating respect for diversity? How do we undo what financier George Soros calls market fundamentalism without resorting to an equally discredited theocratic fundamentalism? I want to end with an interlude and a quick final reread of the Ten Commandments as a resource for business ethics. First, the interlude. I have said very little tonight about Jesus Christ, unusual for a Christian, although not, as I noted earlier, unusual in relation to this topic. Jesus had an ambiguous relationship to the law, and perhaps that is why we Christians do not always go to first principles for ethical rejuvenation. In fact, several gospel readings from last week pivot on Jesus breaking the law. In one case, because he did not rebuke his disciples for plucking grains on the Sabbath, and in another, for healing the man with the withered hand, also on the Sabbath. Breaking the law is serious stuff. This last breach was sufficient for Mark to note that from that moment the Pharisees conspired with Herodians to destroy him. In John's Gospel, Jesus also forgave the woman condemned for adultery. In Mark, he seemed to deny the sanctity of family by making motherhood and brotherhood a condition of faith instead of blood. While the priority for Jesus was always to restore bodily integrity through healing and spiritual integrity through forgiveness, he never ceased being a Jew, never relinquished the integrative role of the law for bringing humanity into relationship with God. In Luke, Jesus is emphatic that it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of the law to be dropped. And in Matthew, he situates himself even more explicitly within the commandments, saying, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill." Jesus focused his ministry not on adherence to the law, but on reclaiming and recasting its spirit. He taught and exemplified fulfillment by expressing an underlying or overarching commandment premised on love. In Mark, Jesus retrieves and relaunches the Shema, the core prayer of Israel. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with your whole heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The commandments without love are as dry and brittle as ethics without moral values. Love colors every command, turning obedience into a yoke that, as Jesus said, is light indeed. Of course, love was inherent in the very gift of God, in the very law that God gifted. Unlike a contract, a covenant is based on asymmetries. The favor of a powerful Lord extended in generosity to those in need or dependence. The 10 Commandments are an act of love, inviting love in return. With retrieval begun, we can end with another relaunch. Questions based on the commandments relating specifically to the issues and practices of managers. With God as priority, how does business strategy advance the project of creation while advancing return for shareholders and benefits for customers? Hard to imagine two things. They seem completely contradictory, and in our discourse, they're considered exclusive. But some of our most difficult challenges and some of our most profound expressions of witness are by living with paradox. Albert Camus, many of you know, was a pacifist, and yet he decided by the end of the war that he would actually participate in the resistance movement, and that he would willingly kill people to advance the cause of freedom in France. And when he wrote about it, and when he explained how he arrived at that decision, he said that it was absolutely repugnant and absolutely necessary. And every time he pulled the trigger, he had to hold those two things in his head. That's the kind of moral imagination and courage that this kind of conflation, of integration, of a moral purpose with business purpose demands of us. It is hard, but to not do it is to absent ourselves from what I think is the defining issue of our time. The second commandment, with God as the only absolute, how can systems and assumptions be restored to flexibility so that innovation develops human freedom as well as economic development? Again, I've literally worked with hundreds of clients in the course of my career. I've been in the service side, I've been in the marketing side, and in the last 10 years as a consultant. A very interesting statistic that emerges in virtually every single industry, in every single consumer product category at least, is a version of the 80-20 rule, that about 80% of consumption is generated by 20% of the user group in any one business. So what you're always trying to do, of course, in business is get to that person. But you run into all sorts of very interesting quandaries when you recognize that. So, for example, we knew that certain products were medicinal but that a small percentage of the population was using them so disproportionately that the medicinal impact was wearing away. Now, the target objective was always to get more of those people, never to talk about, have we created a situation of addiction where the benefit even no longer works, where the benefit has actually become a liability and an imprisonment. And there are hundreds of examples like that. The point is that those issues aren't talked about at all in the day-to-day reality of business encounters like that. With God's name as precious, how do we create problem-solving cultures in companies that leverage the fullest possibilities of dialogue, engaging the fullest capabilities of head, heart, and soul? With a day off decreed as a divine right, how do we pull back from the brink of exhaustion, restoring the value of playing and praying to both replenish the human heart and inspire human creativity for the benefit of life and work? With family sacred, how do we live authentic family values in the workplace and in the products, services, and systems we sell? A corollary question. With family sacred, how do we stop telemarketers from phoning exactly as the family sits down to dinner? With life sacred, how do our contributions to the economy contribute to human integrity and integration? With fidelity as a sacrament, how do our companies enable balance and honor the sacred power of intimacy while creating value and loyalty for customers? With material creations imbued with holiness, how do we produce more enduring quality and less disposable quantities? How do we grow our economy without stealing from the possibilities of future generations? With truth setting us free, how do we go beyond disclosure and transparency to honestly account for our balance sheet performance, balancing financial, social, human, environmental, and moral factors? With serenity as the antidote to greed, how do we affect equity in our organizations, in pay, tax obligations, executive compensation, social infrastructure, and moral governance? All of these questions have ever more detailed subsets relating to strategy, planning, human resources, operations, social responsibility, and effectiveness. The Ten Commandments are a starting point, not a stopping point, a framework for relationship, not a checklist of prohibitions. We must engage and wrestle with them even when resolutions seem unimaginable. And we must own them even though culture rejects their authority. Just as the Jews wrangled to preserve the law under Roman occupation, we too must find the courage and imagination to name the Ten Commandments and claim their meaning in our public dialogue. Another rabbinic source stipulates that one who wishes to achieve sainthood should occupy himself in study and practice of the ethical laws relating to commerce and finance. For some of us, this may be our only chance at canonization. Thank you for your presence and for your patient attention. Thank you.
John will identify the person to whom he best possibility of answering the question. Please give either a minute to get the microphone and speak into it so that we can catch the question on tape and so that you can all hear the question. John?
Thank you.
exhaustive or exhausting? Because, yes. The microphone's coming.
At the beginning of your talk, you spoke about an ethos in the business world that was, for lack of a better word, immoral. And then at the end of the talk, you spoke about we have to. Could you identify the we a little more clearly and relate it to that, the people who create and constitute that ethos that you spoke about at the beginning?
I think that the ethos, more accurately, is amoral, operating on the premise that there are legal parameters inside which we operate and that fulfills our fiduciary duty to shareholders. But of course, the business universe is not homogeneous. It's made up of people like us. And there are people who every day struggle with moral issues. What was interesting was that 5-6 years ago when I started studying theology, no one in the business world, no one in the boardrooms that I was visiting on an ongoing basis talked about this kind of stuff. Today, more and more people are talking about it, just like we are in society. So it's not about us, them. It is about our business systems. And when I say we, I mean myself as a business person, as an influencer of business people, as a day-to-day business consultant, and the other people who are in positions of managerial decision-making and thinking, which again involves an awful lot of us. The progression of ethical thinking in organizations really is a bell curve like on any other issue in society. I would say, and I mean, I've worked in the U.S. with CEOs of very, very large organizations. I've worked mostly with large organizations in Canada. So my context is big business. And what you find is that there are 10 or 15% of senior executives and managers in those big corporations that are deeply, deeply committed to living a moral life in what they do. And they meet, they talk, they actually have a language for having a conversation about some of these issues. They don't always get it right, but they're having a conversation. At the other end, my experience is that there's about 30% of the business population that sees all of this as an infringement on their right to do what they have to do, which is return value to shareholders, end of story. So those are the poles. In the middle are a lot of people who will say, as they did in this trust study, what you're raising is interesting. I don't have time to do that kind of reflection. I'm too busy. I'm too pressured. I've never learned what questions to ask to be able to do that. So what we're seeing is the same kind of migration of sensibility that happened 20 years ago with environmental consciousness. That first started with a few people tying themselves to trees, telling us that we were all wrong, and mostly accusing business people of impropriety. Some of it justified. But it was also too broad. What happened was some people said, hey, you know what, this makes sense. This is a real problem. We've got to do something about it. Other people said, this is a problem that if we manage correctly, makes us ask tougher strategic questions that actually make us more efficient, that actually can help us produce more with less. That's a smart objective if you're in business. And then there are people that said, never want to touch this. I'll break any law I can get away with, or I will, But what happened was that the average, the mean sensibility of the business community is now well beyond sort of the consciousness point on environmental practice. There are environmental standards around the world. There's always a tussle about regulations and cost and stuff. But even as we were saying at dinner, most people are saying, this is just smart business, this is responsible business, I want to do it. We have to fight every day to protect that sensibility. There's an article in this week's Business Week about toxic waste in Europe having been taken over by criminal organizations, by crime families, etc. And so a lot of the industrial waste that goes into eco companies for proper disposal is now showing up for example, on farm fields in Umbria. Just really tragic stuff. So we always have to be on guard for this stuff, but there's a general progress or movement. And what we're now seeing is the same progress or movement beginning to happen around ethical consciousness. Yes, these scandals of the last year have sharpened people's attention on the issue, but the conversation was happening before that, and there are pressure points from all over the world that will keep the conversation focused and happening. So I think we will follow that progression as happened with environmentalism. One last point. Again, most people in North America don't know that the Davis Economic Summit, the economic forum that's been quite prominent, especially for the last 10 years in terms of setting and framing economic policy for the global economy, last year initiated a permanent feature of the Davos Forum headed by the recently retired Archbishop of Canterbury, and he is now creating what will be an organization that will be part of the Davos infrastructure that will carry on a conversation between the world's religious leaders and the world's business leaders. So even that construct would happen, unimaginable 5 years ago, 10 years ago, tells us that there's a hunger to deal with these issues in a new way. So most people still will say that the default position is, I didn't break the law, that's enough. But there are lots of things that happen in the gray areas between morality and legality that are forcing people to say, I have to exercise this consciousness differently today. And I promise I won't take that long to answer future questions. Yep.
John, thank you for the talk. I'm the corporate affairs officer for a global company in the machinery business.
Yep.
And so I write corporate policy. And I found out very early on that to legislate and to enforce and to do it lovingly is quite a different thing than what I had expected to see in this industry. I'd worked in other industries before. But the one thing I was completely unprepared for was that my door it was like a revolving door to a grocery store. People kept coming in and telling me that they were needing something that I couldn't give them with corporate policy. Mm-hmm. So I got a few other people involved, and what's really become evident, especially in some of the more companies that have more a global presence, is the people, its constituents, the population of these companies, more and more and more feel these pressures, don't know what to do with them, and don't know to whom to turn. So what role do our churches play in all this?
Really important question, and a great insight into the reality. People are struggling with these issues. I want to bring up 2 points before getting to the voice of the church. One is that, especially since the scandal started breaking about 1.5 years ago, many more organizations and certainly many more boards and CEOs are aware of ethical responsibilities, and some are firming up codes and putting them in place. But one of the things that's happened is that the code is actually turning out to now be another downloaded pressure on employees. In other words, the management team says, this is our business goal, this is our ethical standard, over to you, go do it. Don't mess up either one of those equations, and then they can stand before regulators and before shareholders and say, we've done the big thinking on this. But of course, it's not at the big thinking level that these problems happen. So people that were already feeling burdened for productivity targets and for lean and mean, restructuring, reengineering, and change fatigue was one of the things that emerged in our research when we were talking to Canadians. Like, people are just tired because there's just been so much stuff they've had to do. that this now becomes another fatiguing issue. You now also have to be moral. You now also have to, take care of this. So the downloading, rather than what you are suggesting, which leads to my second point, which is kind of a dialogue or an engagement around it. Three psychologists, I can remember two of them, David Gardner, who's done a lot of research on management and leadership from a psychological perspective, and I can never pronounce his name, but it's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He's a University of Chicago psychologist who has done a lot of work in the creativity area. They and a third collaborator have just published a book called Good Work, and it looks at the principles of managing for productivity and for profit in a more integrated way. And they looked specifically at case histories within two industries, genetics and in journalism. Both industries that require a high degree of sort of ethical sophistication because of the kinds of issues that are being dealt with every day. And what emerged from that book is that ethics can't be the imposition. It can't be just the code. It has to be some kind of conversation that involves 3 points, 3 nodes. One, the individual person. Like a lot of companies have run into trouble because basically individuals either don't care or they are immoral, to the earlier question, or they've just never had a chance to exercise that imagination as one of their managerial tools. So personal ethical understanding and questioning is the first node. The second is the industry itself has to be in a conversation creating the standards, like doctors, like other professions that have a professional association that sets bare minimum codes that require punishment if people transgress those codes. Like there are a lot of industry associations that have a lot of industry standards attached to them, but no watchdog, no teeth, no bite to actually enforce. So what they were saying is personal understanding and willingness to engage on this issue, a robust and dynamic association nodal point, and then the third is a conversation with the society itself, where the culture is, what its parameters, what its horizon is. And that to me is where our religious leaders in our churches have a legitimate role to play. They can be the third element in that node, and that means engaging in a more constructive critique than always a negative critique, especially in discussion around business issues, than has happened in the past. But there are responsibilities on all three to check in with each other, and then the learning or the resolutions or the dynamic sort of evolution of these things happens in that interplay. So definitely a role, but often the role right now isn't often engaged in a very constructive way.
You mentioned the majority of these people involved in this business are not concerned with morality of the Ten Commandments. And when you figure that it's against the law in Canada or the United States to even teach the Ten Commandments in a public school, it doesn't surprise me. And unless they're regular churchgoers, they might show some concern in this area.
Right. And my orientation, again, the question was asked of who are we? I was speaking from the point of view of a business person who believes and is unwilling to continue to live with a divorce between my professional obligations and my professional joys, really. So is it a hard conversation to have, for example, in a multicultural environment? Absolutely. Hans Kung's work and others that have been really active in the area of the global ethic, in fact, show that the primary principles that are embedded in the Ten Commandments work across the major traditions. Of course, there are differences, and they have to be respected. And when I talk about claiming the Ten Commandments, I'm not talking about imposing the Ten Commandments. I'm talking about having enough understanding for myself or questions within myself that I can bring those questions into a debate, make them one of the issues of consideration as organizations go through decisions. Now, that divorce between faith and business life has been ending not because of managerial decision making, but because of the pastoral need of some of those people that are carrying the burden now of both living ethically within their company and living successfully within their company. Lots of organizations, for example, participate in the spirituality in the workplace movement. There's one at a conference in Toronto earlier this year. There were several corporations present that talked about having created silence rooms, prayer rooms for their employees. They're not Christian chapels or they're not mosques, but they allow people to go and reflect when they feel the need to somehow do that kind of spiritual censoring. So we have this false divide, in a sense, within our secular thinking of this, that the two are completely apart. In their everyday practice, people are muddling and confusing and interconnecting them. And as we spend more and more time in workplaces, we're going to be looking for issues and answers around our meaning in those places. So there's a pastoral pressure that's undermining sort of that strategic separation. And again, I'm not saying that all business people are immoral. I'm saying that there is pressure that when somebody does become immoral, it has a disproportionate impact and it can pull a lot of other organizations into imbalance.
We often tend to speak of these, like Enron and WorldCom and all these people, as if they're somehow disconnected from us. But isn't it each and every one of us that feeds this machine by our lust for the third car, the bigger house, the constant raise of pay? Isn't it each and one of us who just sort of, it really is the cause that they simply fill the demand?
Well, I think that the key point is that it's not an us and them. It is a society of which even churches and even religious and spiritual people participate in that has made the divide between the moral thinking of something like the Ten Commandments and what we do in the everyday operate quite distinctly. Like Purpura's book was very interesting. He explores how can people believe profoundly. I mean, these are not people, they're not doubters. People believe strongly in a relationship with God, in some kind of transcendent reality. Whatever it is, 90%, and I think the statistics for Canada are about 86 or 85%, so high numbers of people believe firmly and strongly. The disconnect is that less than half of those people actually behave in their business workplaces as if those beliefs had any relevance. So our question becomes, what's the disconnect? Some of it is relevant. Some of it is we haven't talked about these issues. We've accepted the notion of divide and haven't talked through the opportunity for animating more imaginative, creative, innovative managerial thinking by reflecting on those moral issues. So some of it is a language thing. But in Purpura's analysis, what's interesting is that he says that basically it's a disconnection of the heart. People believe with their heads, and then they make their decisions in the workplace with the head, and it's easy to have the divide. Our heart is not engaged. A friend of mine who is an ordained United Church minister, had originally studied as a lawyer, felt this call of vocation, left the Catholic Church, and she was finally ordained several years ago in the United Church. She works in her ministry includes working with executives on Bay Street, and in her model, in her analysis of what's been going on, she has conversation with people where when they have their heads down and are doing their work, they actually thrive. They actually enjoy it. They feel engaged. They feel rewarded. Their heads are down. They feel fulfilled human beings. What happens is when they put their heads up, they go, oh, there's more to this. And maybe what I did yesterday that felt so great, if I think about it in this context, I better go talk to somebody about this because it's creating real soul-level angst. So she called this heads up, heads down. And and because we're all working harder, we're all sort of tending to keep our heads down more. Porpora would say that it's heads down, heart open, would be his model. That the issue of reconnecting belief to practice is not more head stuff, or it may be more analysis, but it actually is the heart's experience of faith that at that moment compels us to live it not only in private moments, but in exchanges, in what we do in community. Not necessarily to proselytize, which I think had been our old model, but to live faithfully and let the universe be changed by that. My professor, Ron Mercier, in a course that I'm doing now on spirituality and ethics, was talking in a lecture a couple of weeks ago about private spirituality basically being an oxymoron. That the idea that spirituality can be exercised as a private, owned kind of thing, what we were talking about in the car with Michael, is fallacy. Spirituality, as soon as it's authentic, moves us into relationship with the Spirit, which is what the word means, but in relationship because it is the Spirit and none of us own it, with also each other. So the question then becomes, how do we activate our hearts? The answer, as far as I've been able to sort of imagine it and work it out, is face-to-face encounter. Many of our harshest business decisions are made in very clinical situations. Boardrooms, offices, computers, desks, decks. Like you get a research report, you dissect it, you make your decision, away you go. When human dynamics are put into that decision-making process, people change. It forces them to reflect. Like Paul O'Neill was very maligned for many of the things that he did when he was Commerce Secretary in the Bush administration and he just got fired. But what most people don't know is that when Paul O'Neill was head of Alcoa, because of shareholder protest at some meetings, some of the church groups that held shares in Alcoa were challenging their employee policies in the Maquiladora corridor, the factories along the Mexican-U.S. border, where workers on one side of the border, on the American side, were of course getting all their rights and all their, salaries and everything else, and on the other side there was a huge gap. And O'Neill, I think it was like 2 or 3 years of hearing all these complaints, finally got on an airplane and went down to Mexico with his HR people, finance people, and they went and talked to the workers. And then he went home with the worker and found this person who had been, an Alcoa employee for, 10 years, living in a place that had no running water, no electricity, and just, it blew his mind, and they reinvested a whole bunch of money to create employee housing, like we used to have when my father first emigrated to Canada in the 1950s. It's something that it's sort of like a developing economy requirement. He had that insight not by reading the research, but by face-to-face encounter that somehow changed his heart. And again, a lot of people made fun of him for getting on an airplane with Bono and going to Africa and looking at development issues through that kind of encounter, and yet it is face-to-face. We've reduced too much of our relationship in our reality through the technology filter, which allows us to be very clinical in the way we make decisions. Watching the business, the ROB channel the other night, they were talking, some large corporation CEO was on there saying, you know, our industry is down, but boy, we're up. I mean, we got our head count under control early in the process. To me, there's the issue of language. There's the, you know, he didn't say it broke our hearts to have to fire 5,000 very loyal employees. But for the necessity of this situation, for the fact that our industry is in recession and that everybody else is declining, we did it as thoughtfully, as humanly as we possibly could, and here's we are. That's not what he said. He said, we got our head count down. Clinical, not a heart connection.